Hi there, I'm your host, John Ivison. I'm joined as usual by Andrew Balfour of Rubicon Strategies and Marcella and Munro of Macmillan Vantage. Guys, during the pandemic, I stopped asking you what interesting things you'd been doing during the week, because generally it came down to lint cleaning on the washer dryer or something equally mundane. But Marcella, this week, I've spotted that you actually had done something quite interesting in a place that we know quite well, the Royal York Hotel.
Yeah, our friend Shanann Govani, who said to say hi to you, actually invited me to be his +1 at the opening of the library bar. So it's fantastic. I recommend it.
Right. It's a kind of iconic bar. I don't know how long it's been around for. Did they tell you what the history of the place was?
1929, I'm going to say it opened.
Right, and they've refurbished the whole thing, right?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because, obviously it was a very deco. The building's deco, the bar was very deco. They've kind of backdated and updated it. So it's very chic and modern, but it's also true to the deco style, which is really, really gorgeous.
All right, well, that's a destination if and when I ever travel again. Andrew, what about you? Anything interesting, or was it lint cleaning again?
No, Marcella and I were even out for drinks in Toronto together.
Oh, wow. Oh, well, that's how the jet set live. All right, to business. Ministers are still bedding in their departments. Parliament is still in hiatus. So Ottawa's been a kind of sleepy town for the last little while, but not so Glasgow. And the COP26 conference was there. Justin Trudeau was there. He made something of a splash when he was talking about international pledges on climate action. He made the commitment that Canada would cap oil and gas emissions, and he said that we should cover 60% of the world's greenhouse gases with carbon taxes. It's currently only about 20. So he was pushing for a concerted global effort. For some, like my colleague Terry Corcoran, it's all farce, a net zero fiction that will come undone as developing nations like India resist the urge to take action, and developed nations abandon their plans because developing nations are essentially eating their lunch and continuing to expand and pollute. So how do we think Trudeau did? I mean, he got the backing of the IMF and the World Bank for this idea of expanding a global carbon price, or creating a minimum global carbon price. Do you think anybody's buying, Marcella?
Well, first of all, it's nice to have the U.S. back in the discussion, right? They've re-entered the chat, so you've got to think that helps on some of these key questions.
Although crucially, they don't have a carbon price, which I think is a problem.
Yeah, well, I don't think that door is completely shut yet. But listen, there were some important milestones this week. I think for those of us that watch climate and energy policy, their commitment on methane reduction, very, very critical. And I do think the emissions cap is a good idea. I mean, I would point out to the, obviously there was the typical, as you would expect, people in Alberta that were going a bit bananas about it. We put the cap on emissions in Alberta. It was with the cooperation of the major oil and gas producers. And I'd have to take another look, but I don't actually think the Canadian government ripped that up because it was essentially...
No, they didn't. In fact, the 100 million megaton 100 million megaton cap is still there, and it still allows expansion, right?
Yeah, there's still room for expansion, although, as we know, there's no new oil sands projects coming. On the carbon price and the commitments, again, I think these are all things that are in the right direction. We still need to have a much more serious global conversation. We're probably not going to meet our targets without billions, trillions of dollars more investment. But when it comes to the rich versus the poor countries, I do have sympathy for the poorer countries, right? Because we know that a lot of this climate change that's been man-made and person-made over the years is because the Western worlds, the Western nations have been living high off the hog, burning oil and gas for the last, couple hundred years and getting very wealthy and comfortable. And it's a bit rich at this point, I think, for us to, turn around and tell developing countries and countries that are struggling economically that they have to do as much of the heavy lifting as we do. I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's reasonable.
But they can't have a pass, otherwise.
You also see people like India.
They can't have a pass, surely.
Well, India is a good example too. You raised India. Look, India's surpassed their targets in terms of their installation of renewables. So it's not like these countries aren't doing anything.
What about you, Andrew? Do you think Trudeau looked good this week?
Well, I mean, there was certainly no shortage of announcements. There was that, Canada, amongst many other nations, will stop in lending money to be invested in oil and gas in other countries. That's a significant one. Although, granted, that doesn't include China, Korea.
It does include China. China's committed not to funding coal-fired power stations outside China. Unfortunately, it's still funding them inside China.
Well, they're still building them like once a week.
Yeah.
But I mean, there was also, speaking of coal, the government of Canada made, there's so many announcements that were made, but we will stop thermal coal exports by 2030. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised by this government's stance on coal, given that there's a huge chunk of people in this Prime Minister's office and in this government who are part of Dalton McGuinty's switch to get rid of coal, so that shouldn't surprise anyone. I mean, I'm happy I don't work in the coal sector right now. But just for interest's sake, nowhere on the western seaboard, with the exception of Prince Rupert and the Port of Metro Van, allows thermal coal to get shipped out. So the Americans actually, by rail, send all their thermal coal up to BC, and it goes out through there. So the Americans probably weren't super thrilled about that announcement.
On your McGuinty analogy, the only way that the coal-fired power stations were closed down in Ontario was because Ontario increased its nuclear energy capacity. I think mainly at Darlington power plant. And we've now got an environment minister who is clearly not on side with nuclear. So there is trouble ahead on that front. I do think this is
the wind farms, John.
I do think that this is the battle of our times, though, because this government is not going to reverse on a carbon tax, and it's got the parliamentary majority, if you include the other parties, to continue ratcheting it upwards. It's not going to back down on any of its other climate commitments. So to make sure this pain and upheaval is not in vain, we clearly need other people to step up as well. I don't think voluntarily urging them to have a global minimum carbon price is going to particularly work. But I do think that some kind of border tax adjustment, some kind of tariff on carbon, which the EU is already in favour of, and I think the Americans are keen on it too, although how they reconcile that to not having a carbon price, I'm not sure. But I do think that the solution will be... Some of the states do. So I think the solution will essentially be that there will be a tax on carbon at the border.
Yeah, well, look. When we were building our carbon plan under Notley in Alberta, we talk about carbon pricing. Some people like it, some people don't. I still think it's the most efficient way to shift this conversation to get the resources we need into renewables. But you don't do that. You shouldn't be doing that in a vacuum. And like I said last week, we need an adult conversation. So some of the tools you have at your disposal as a government is to protect your trade-exposed industries, right? Right. Those things are really important. So if you think about something like the cement industry, if you don't protect them through a carbon pricing regime, then all that means is you're going to get your cement from China. So.
Oh, but the alternative to that is to put a tax at the border on Chinese cement, which is not subject to a carbon tax, and that's what Trudeau was saying this week when he was talking about the aluminium industry. Same analogy. Yeah.
So all those trade-exposed industries, you either need to give them a break on this side, or, to your point, a tariff on the other.
Right. Moving along on the domestic political front, let's talk about the dog that did not bark. Erin O'Toole has been conspicuous by his absence, has not made any public comments on COP or on climate, which, given that that's been the news of the week, seems kind of odd. He has been talking about raising the Canadian flag on federal buildings in time for Remembrance Day, which, as I wrote today, the government is going to do, so that'll give him one less thing to talk about. And he's also talked about Air Canada's president not speaking French, which is somewhat virtual signalling on his part. What is Erin O'Toole going to talk about in future? Marcella? I
mean, I don't know. I think it's those issues, are preposterous for him to be commenting on. I mean, does he somehow think the federal government has the ability to tell the president, the CEO of Air Canada, what he should and shouldn't be doing? I mean, we'll see if he lasts till next week, but that won't be anything that anyone in government's done. It would be his board. And on the flag raising, I mean, again, Erin O'Toole is former Veterans Affairs Minister. He himself served. I don't think it's I don't think it's a bad issue. He didn't come off sounding super cranky old man about it. He was very careful in how he was talking about the Indigenous leaders he's been speaking to about this issue. So that's fine. But you've got to think that if you're trying to turn the Tory ship in the right direction on climate, that you would take the chance this week to at least comment on the major issues that are flying in and out of COP. Right, to show that you actually do have some legitimate policy chops on this issue. That doesn't mean, of course, agreeing with everything the government's doing, but it's just baffling to me that he wouldn't at least say something.
I mean, Andrew, presumably he's not saying anything because it will just deepen the rifts and the wounds that are already livid inside the caucus.
Well, that's exactly what it is. I mean, he's already got. I mean, at this point in time, if you read some of the stuff that's going out, with the number of unnamed sources going on in the Conservative Party, it reminds me of when we were in opposition, or even still now. But the Conservatives are usually much more tight-lipped about this stuff than they are right now. And, you have people just talking openly to reporters about what's going on in caucus meetings. So if he did come out and say anything reasonable about some of the very reasonable things that the Prime Minister's been doing, they call it the anti-Erin people in his caucus would get really mad, because those probably are also the anti-vaxxer people too. Right.
But I mean, most of the people I was reading about, and the people I've spoken to are saying, look, the main problem is here, he brought in a whole bunch of policies and he didn't tell us first. That right. Seems to me the irritation, rather than let's get rid of Erin.
Sure, but I mean, there's no caucus discipline whatsoever at this point in time.
Right.
No, and he still hasn't got away from the thorny issue of this group of 5 or 6 unnamed MPs who don't want to be vaxxed, and how that's kind of derailed them on those questions as well.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, though, he's already said they will not be in the House of Commons, at which point it ceases to become a real issue, I think.
One thing about the flags is throwing meat to the base. He wrote an op-ed in the Sun Chain, which is obviously conservative, so him and his team are clearly trying to keep him on side with those folks at this point in time. And
I think that's a fair enough issue, though. I mean, Trudeau said in the mid-campaign that the flags would stay down until Indigenous communities essentially gave their consent to raise them again. Well, that's not what they're going to do, though. They're going to tell Indigenous communities they're putting the flag back up, which is not the impression that Trudeau gave, and I think it's extremely disingenuous on his part. So it is, to me, a real issue for O'Toole to point out that Trudeau says one thing one day and another the next day.
Well, we don't know that the Indigenous community isn't going to give him the license to put them back up.
Well, there's no unanimity in the Indigenous community, which is why they're not even trying to seek it.
Right.
Anyhow, finally, to wrap up, something that kind of grabbed my attention, a little nugget. The NDP are calling to change the archaic dress code of the House, requiring men to wear a jacket and tie. Apparently, it wants to update them to accommodate transgender, non-binary and two-spirited members. But to be frank, I don't get it, because those people, if they didn't want to, there is no dress code for women. Presumably there would be no dress code for anybody who didn't identify as a man. Am I being too crusty to suggest there should be some standards in Parliament, or should we allow our MPs to turn up in hoodies and drawstring pants? Marcella, you're our fashion correspondent.
Well, I don't really enjoy the thought of seeing our MPs walk into the chamber looking like they just came from a Drake concert. So I think there should be, as much as I love Drake, I think that there should be some kind of standards. You probably can take a look at it. I mean, I think maybe the all-party committee should probably take a look at the rules and regulations to make sure they're not completely arcane. But I don't think, it's not just decorum, right? I think it's about showing respect for the place. It's about showing respect for Canadians, showing up like you look like you're going to work is what I would think the job requires. So, we had this issue with Michelle Rempel last year, I think it was, and she wore a dress that some people thought was more for the nightclub than for the House of Commons, and she took some fire with that. But the Speaker didn't rule that she couldn't wear that dress. So I guess that's the question: does there need to be a broader discussion about what respecting the place and the people you're serving require?
Andrew?
Well, I would like to look at this in a different way. So the mechanics of this absurd thing that the and I'm going to say it again, it's absurd that they're suggesting this. I'd love to wear joggers to work, but then I wouldn't have any clients. If they do put this forward, it will have to be studied at committee, like the PROC committee, which most Canadians don't know what the committee system is or that the PROC exists, but they would have to have a committee of members of parliament study for weeks. And like what they're going to invite fashion designers to be parliamentary witnesses. Like who's on this witness list? How's this going to work? Then it's going to have to go through a committee. They're going to have to write a report on it. It's going to have to go back to the House. It might get amended. It could take up a whole bunch of parliamentary time in a minority government. It's stupid.
You would have thought that the NDP, given the shellacking, let's put it that way, that they got in the election, they certainly didn't get the result they wanted. You would think they have better things to do than this.
I used to want to do a segment when I was at CBC called Political Fashion Police, because let's face it, most politicians aren't good dressers.
No.
And so if they really want to start getting into this, then I think they should give us a chance at least to point out the who wore it better, and mostly they aren't in Parliament.
Right. Okay, well look, we're going to wrap up. Thanks very much. We'll see you all again next week.
Thanks, guys.